I'm going to take you back to August 2015, to a random sunny Thursday that probably doesn't mean anything to very many people, but it's a day that'll be forever etched in my memory. I spent that day, in all places, in a Catholic church on the outskirts of Liverpool. And I can remember so vividly standing in that church. I looked up at the ceiling, to see the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. I was blown away by the sheer scale of the building. I was looking at all these ornate carvings and thinking that they probably have a proper name and I should probably know what that was. And as I lowered my gaze, I could see pew after pew after pew of people. If I turned and looked to the back of the church, I'd see even more people standing there. And I knew that I was looking around at all of these things as a bit of a distraction, because I knew that if I lowered my gaze and looked a little bit more closely, if I looked at the faces of those people in the pews, I'd see tears. I knew that I would see hand after hand after hand reaching out to the person next to them for support. And whilst I know that there must have been music playing in that moment, the only sound I remember is the sound of muffled sobs. And yet even that, I knew, was a distraction, because I would rather be looking at those tear-stained faces and listening to those muffled sobs than turning my attention to the front of the church. Because I knew that if I turned and looked ahead of me, I'd see the one thing I didn't want to see. At the front of the church, there was a coffin. And inside that coffin was the body of a wonderful, generous 28-year-old man who'd taken his own life. I couldn't, and I still can't, begin to imagine what thoughts could possibly have gone through the mind of somebody so obviously loved by so many people to make him think that that was the best choice. And in that moment, I realised that those thoughts, whatever they were, hadn't just gone through his mind, but they were going through the minds of people across the country and around the world. And I realised for the first time that there was absolutely nothing that I could do about that. For the first time, I felt completely helpless, overwhelmed, and so small. That feeling stayed with me throughout the service. It stayed with me as we walked outside into the bright sunshine. It stayed with me as I sat in the car and sobbed and sobbed and sobbed and sobbed into the arms of my husband. And it even stayed with me after, in the wake, even though his friends and family were sharing stories. And at times, as I looked around me, I could almost convince myself I was at a 30th birthday party. Pictures of him laughing being shared, stories, jokes. But all of it was marred by this sense of complete and utter overwhelm and helplessness. And that stayed with me in the days and weeks that followed. I couldn't get my head round how to carry on, knowing that so many people were struggling in the way that he was without anyone around them knowing. And I came to the realisation that if that feeling was going to go, it was going to go because I would have to do something differently. So what I decided to do were little things like raising money for Mind instead of birthday presents, and starting to tell the story of that day, starting to open up about mental health and suicide and how it actually brings us all together. And actually, I felt like I was doing quite well. I told the story in front of lots of people. I asked people how they were. I tried to remove the stigma from discussing all of these issues. Friends and family members opened up to me about how they were struggling, and I felt like I was being of some use. And then one very, very cold morning in January, I woke up and looked at my phone, and what I read was a WhatsApp message that was a suicide note. It's from a friend that I knew had been struggling, but I'd hoped or thought was on the mend. She thanked me, she apologised, she asked me to forgive her. It felt like everything I'd been doing over the last few months had been for nothing. I cannot tell you the relief that washed through me when I opened the next message on my phone from another friend who she'd contacted the night before and who was able to get to her in time to get the paramedics and help to save her life. I was able to go and see her. And those days afterwards were so difficult. The weeks afterwards were still a challenge. I saw her adapting to new medication. I saw how jumpy she was. I saw her burst into tears. And worst of all, I had to listen to her apologise for being a burden. She felt somehow she wasn't worthy of the love of the people around her and that we would rather not be there listening to her problems. But I knew that I could say with absolute certainty that however difficult those days were, however hard it might feel, I would always, always rather be there by her side than telling the story of how she died.